You might be wondering why I'm wearing a hard hat, gloves, and protective glasses. Well, it's because we're talking about administrative authority. Now, I have a previous video. It's very, very, very important that you watch that video. It's the introduction to these administrative authorities, talking about the toolbox. So that's why it has to do with that, the toolbox. And whether you have a toolbox or you're like me and you got a tool belt, as I discussed in that video, which you need to watch before this one, there's different types of tools, tax tools like regulations, revenue rulings, revenue procedures, private letter rulings, and other administrative authorities by the IRS that are very helpful for the tax research process. So make sure you watch that introductory video. This video continues with that discussion, and it focuses on various authorities, various administrative authorities, and it talks about those. It gives some examples. It talks about citations. It's so you have more practice to be a better tax professional. All right, let's go ahead and let's jump into those materials now. We have 44 questions that focus on administrative tax authority. Let's go ahead and jump into question 1. What department and agency of the U.S. government administers the federal tax law? So we're talking about department and agency of the U.S. government. So think about the 3 branches of government. Of the 3 branches, departments and agencies, they're in the executive branch. Now, the executive branch, that's the U.S. president, has various cabinets or groups, like Department of the State or War. Treasury. Treasury is tasked with the raising of revenue to fund the U.S. government. Well, within the Treasury Department, the IRS is the department or agency in the U.S. government that is responsible for administering the federal tax law. So it's very, very important you understand that the IRS is the answer here, and it's a subset of the Department of Treasury. Let's move on to question 2. Section 7805 of the Internal Revenue Code authorizes the IRS to perform what activities? So Section 7805A authorizes the Treasury Secretary or his or her delegate, so that could be the Commissioner of Internal Revenue or the groupings under the Internal Revenue as the structure goes down, to prescribe rules and regulations. So this is where we have the main grant by Congress to the Department of Treasury, to the IRS, that regulations, rules and regulations necessary to administer the code can be written. This code section gives the IRS the general authority to issue binding rules and regulations concerning Title 26 of the U.S. Code, which focuses on income tax. So Section 7805 gives general authority to IRS to administer regs. Now, various code sections, for example, Section 385 or in the 1500s, there's different code sections that specifically grant the IRS, Department of Treasury, the ability to promulgate regulations on specific topics. Like, for example, 385 deals with corporate tax, debt versus equity. What is the difference between them? And it specifically states in 385A that the IRS, Department of Treasury, they can administer regs in order to clarify that. Now, when you have a general grant of authority, like in Section 7805A, you still got to worry about deference issues. So yes, there's general authority given out throughout the entire tax law, but sometimes courts question regulations, and that's the deference issue I've talked about in the introduction video to administrative tax authority. Let's move on to question 3. The IRS issues numerous pronouncements. And as we learned, there's a lot, right? That's our toolbox theme. There's lots of different tools when it comes to tax research, and you've acquired a bunch of different tools to add to your tax research toolbox with respect to administrative authority. Name and describe 4 that are the most important in conducting federal tax research. So the first one, and we're focusing on executive administrative authority, not legislative, right? So not the code or items related to legislative like treaties. We're not talking about judicial, so not case law. The most important of the administrative executive pronouncements issued by the IRS, regulations, because those are the strongest. If they are indeed law, they will be binding on a taxpayer that the situation applies. So regulations are the main formal process, the main formal pronouncement that the IRS and Treasury use to clarify and administer tax law. Now, I just want to focus on the other 2 binding types of the administrative pronouncements. So regulations can be binding. Revenue rulings, rev rulings as we abbreviate them, Those are also very important when it comes to administrative authority, and those can be binding on a taxpayer if the facts line up and they apply. Revenue rulings are a memo format. So there's facts, and they're also similar to case. They're similar to applying like a case. So I'll put similar to case. If you have facts in your respective taxpayer, you can use revenue rulings and match up facts or distinguish, compare, those types of ideas. And those are binding on the taxpayer. Revenue or rev procs, revenue procedures, those are also binding if they apply, and they're more general and they give a lot of procedural guidance, like how to issue, how to request a private letter ruling, those types of items. So these are the three potentially binding types of primary administrative authority. Now I want to go over here and put a break, change the color, and I'm going to do the fourth one. So there's so many other administrative authorities out there, but I will say that PLRs, private letter rulings, are very important in practice, because the idea is that as you go more and more high up in terms of what is considered binding, right? You've got the Constitution, you've got the Internal Revenue Code, you've got regulations. A lot of times you're going to have situations where it's hard to find an answer. And if you use just those three things, you're not going to get down to the meat. You're not going to be able to compare facts. So a lot of times you got to get down to private letter rulings. Now, private letter rulings are persuasive. They're not binding, but you can still use them when it comes to under this substantial understatement penalty for a tax professional. Private letter rulings are similar in structure to revenue rulings. So they're a ruling, meaning that there's cases and the IRS has ruled on them. And actually, we're going to talk later about private letter rulings and how if a private letter ruling is even really important, the IRS could elevate it to a revenue ruling if they see it enough or specific unique instance. So private letter rulings, I would say, are probably the fourth most important, right? Number 1, 2, and 3 are definitely the most important of the four types of. There's so many different types we're going to see throughout this in the previous video of administrative authorities, but definitely the big three are the three binding ones. I would say the fourth is probably private letter rulings. We'll talk more about private letter rulings later on. All right, let's go to question 4. So question 4 asks, define the terms regulation and treasury decision. What are TDs or treasury decisions? Where are TDs published so that interested parties can comment on them? So regulations, the definition of a regulation. So regulations constitute the IRS's official interpretation. It goes through the official process, the comment period, the public notice period. You get to hear public hearings. You get all this stuff that goes before the IRS. So regulations constitute the IRS's official interpretation of a portion of the Internal Revenue Code. Treasury decisions, or TDs as we call them, TDs are documents that explain and contain the text of a final or temporary decision. So that's where the regs get published. So regs get published as a treasury decision, and then the treasury decisions, regs get published as TDs. And then those TDs, they go in the Federal Register, which the Federal Register deals with CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. That's where all regulations for the entire U.S. law, U.S. code, they go into the CFR, and the Federal Register updates that. So that's really what those items are. Treasury decisions are published in the Federal Register, as I said, and sometime later in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. But Federal Register is where we officially go with respect to that item. Okay, number 5. A tax researcher should not ignore proposed regulations. Comment on this statement. So this is a true statement. It's very, very true, and let me explain. Although proposed regulations have not yet been incorporated to administrative tax law, and they are not binding, so they're merely persuasive, so they're not binding, it should not be ignored because they generally represent the IRS's current understanding of an issue, and many of the provisions of proposed regulations may eventually become a final regulation. So the idea is that a proposed regulation gets issued, IRS is going to take up comments on that, and then final regulations get issued. And I will tell you that for most provisions in the tax law, there's not much change when it comes from the proposed to final. There are some provisions where there's major changes, and they usually end up being more newer concepts in the tax law. For example, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we had code sections like Section 199 Cap A with nothing in the code like that ever. And then we have these proposed regulations, and you've got thousands of comment letters, hundreds of thousands of pages for the IRS to read and consider, and lots of public comments. And there was significant changes from the proposed regulations to final. But most provisions, they don't really change that much from the proposed. There might be some tweaks here and there, but not as much. So it's very important that you focus on proposed regulations, because that's how the IRS understands an issue, and eventually final regulations, it's a good measure to see how the final regulations will develop. Okay, question 6. Define and distinguish between general, interpretive, so general and interpretive are the same, and legislative regulations. So general regulations, also known as interpretive regulations, are issued under the general authority granted to the IRS to interpret the language of the code. So we're talking about Section 7805A. So that is that general grant of authority. Now, when it comes to legislative regulations, the IRS is directed by Congress to fulfill a lawmaking function and to specify substantive requirements of a tax provision. The regulations ordered by the code in this manner carry the authority of the statute itself and are not easily challenged by taxpayers. So let me change my font color. Let's do red. So general, we got legislative. So legislative regulations, the code section itself dictates that the IRS or Department of Treasury needs to clarify and create the actual rules. So perfect example, we talked about this earlier. Section 385, dealing with debt and equity. And in the 1500s, if you go to Section 1500s for consolidated returns, and if you're watching this in the future and the 1500s are no longer consolidated, just find the consolidated return rules. At the time of the video, it's in the 1500s. You will see that there's a code section that specifically states that Congress wants the IRS to provide rules in the area because it's a very technical area. Versus general just applies to everything else in the code, and that's where deference comes in. So when it's legislative regulations, you better believe, almost surely, it's given the same weight as the Internal Revenue Code section. When it comes to general regulations, almost all time it's given full binding force. However, there are times where deference becomes an issue, and I talked about that in the intro video, so go back and watch that. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Question 7. What are temporary regulations? What weight do they carry in the tax researcher's analysis? So temporary regulations are issued to provide a taxpayer with some immediate guidance. So it's all about immediate guidance. So immediate guidance concerning a new provision of the law. Until a temporary regulation is replaced with the final regulation, the tax researcher should treat the temporary regulation as though it were finalized. So treat it as if it's a final regulation when it's issued. So treat it like a final regulation, as if it was a final regulation, and assign it the presumption of the force of law. Again, subject to deference. So subject to the deference rules, which I talk about in the intro video. Now, there are some limitations. Consequently, it's important to distinguish between temporary and proposed regulations. Proposed regulations, as I mentioned earlier, are not binding. They are not binding, so they are not, proposed regulations are not the same. So they are given the same treatment as a final regulation, and the idea is that it's subject to the deference and potentially can be binding. Now, remember that temporary regulations, they're fully in effect and must be followed until they're superseded, whereas proposed regulations are not in effect at all. Because again, the idea is that proposed regulation is likely to end up in a final regulation. It doesn't have to, but it can. There's also the 3-year rule. The 3-year rule says that if a temporary regulation is issued as of a date, and I talk about the date in the introduction to administrative authority video, there was no, as of a certain date, you had 3 years from when the temporary regulation was effective, and after that it lapsed. It was no longer law, no longer good law. And at a certain point before that date, if a temporary regulation was issued, there was no 3-year rule. It was just however long until something came along and superseded it. So very interesting. That's why you might see some temporary regulations still in the Code of Federal Regulations for tax law. Okay, question 8. The burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that a provision of the regulation is improper. How could this affect one's tax research? So I'm telling you a true statement that the burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that a provision of the regulations is improper. And that goes, again, to the deference of a respective item. And by the way, deference goes both ways. It can be said that, okay, well, if a regulation's out there, then a taxpayer can argue, well, I don't think the regulation should be binding on me because I think that the code was interpreted this way through history, through congressional history, through a committee report, through the Joint Committee on Taxation, and the regulation, which is a separate branch of government, right? That's executive branch. They've done something improper. That's the idea. So how could this statement affect one's tax research? Regulations are generally viewed as having full force and effect of law. Consequently, a taxpayer's challenge to a regulation typically must assert an improper exercise. So there must be an improper exercise of IRS power. So it's not an area where the IRS has the ability to rule. That's the idea. Or an overly broad application of a rule that is not authorized by code. So that's where this deference idea comes into play, this administrative law deference. The idea is that it's an improper use of the IRS power, thinking about the three branches of government. And remember, the issue here is, in the Constitution, Congress has the ability to make taxes and raise revenue that way. So not the executive branch. That's the idea of this deference. Will the courts defer to the administrative authority, the executive authority, with respect to interpreting the tax law, with respect to writing the tax law? Now, in questioning the validity of a regulation, the tax researcher must be aware of accuracy penalties that Congress has enacted. If a practitioner chooses to ignore an administrative element of the tax law, he or she must possess substantial authority to do so to avoid these penalties. And substantial authority comes from these different types of primary authorities I've been talking to you about in your toolbox from the various topics such as legislative authority, judicial authority, administrative authority. So you need to have that. So that is really what deference gets at. Again, it gets at this improper exercise of IRS power or an overly broad application of a rule. That's another one. Application of a rule that is not authorized by code. So overly broad application of a rule, not authorized by code. That's really what deference gets at. Improper exercise of IRS power or an overly broad application of a rule. All right, let's go on to question 9. In general, what is the effective date of a new regulation? So under section 7805B, subsection B, so 7805B, a regulation is effective on the date in which the regulation was filed in the Federal Register. So date filed in the Federal Register. Now there is one exception to this, and that deals with regulations that apply retroactively back in time, because it wouldn't be the date filed in the Federal Register, it'd be specifically stated in the regulation. That's what it'd have to be. The date filed in the Federal Register is when the regulation becomes effective. All right, let's move on now to question 10 and another topic. What is a revenue ruling? A revenue ruling is an official pronouncement of the national office. So it's from the national level, the national office. It's not from the district or regional office. It's from the national office of the IRS. So National Office of IRS. And it deals with an application of code and regulations to a specific factual situation. So when I say memo, if I ever tell you that, oh, something is structured like a memo, that means it's applied specifically to a fact situation, like a case. So think of it like case law. So it's a memo format where you have the facts, issue, analysis, and conclusion. So it's a memo format. A taxpayer usually submits a revenue ruling, but not always the case. Revenue rulings can come from the national office, and they kind of they create hypothetical situations to kind of encompass multiple cases. Most revenue rulings indicate how the IRS will treat a given taxpayer's transaction, and that is why they are indeed binding if they apply to a taxpayer in terms of the rules and whatnot. Okay, question 11. Describe the structure of a typical revenue ruling. We talked about it, right? This is easy. So for those of you that haven't yet watched my video on how to write a tax memo, go watch that. It's structured very similar like that. You've got facts, you've got issue, you've got analysis and law, and you've got conclusion. Now, it might be labeled a little bit differently, but that's really what it is. So a revenue ruling, it includes several different things. The ruling begins with a statement of issues that are involved. So actually, the issue part is usually where it starts. So it usually starts with the issue involved. Okay, so we'll put that as one. Memo starts with the facts, but for a rev ruling, starts with the issue. And the reason why is because IRS just has so many rev rulings, it at least shows you, like gives you a summary of what the issue at hand is. Then those facts will be presented. So facts next, then we'll have the analysis and law and conclusion. There might be some additional items, including, so IRS holding is also the same thing as conclusion, and a company's explanation of how and why the IRS arrived at conclusion. Also, they provide the names of the parties in case you want to know who at the IRS, because sometimes you might see there's a specific employee of the IRS that is consistent on a topic, or they're in the same area. And who knows, you might be going to a conference, AICPA, ABA, and you might see this person there. You might be able to ask questions. Of course, with the IRS, as many of you know, they stick to a script on their respective topics, so it's going to be hard to get, you know, responses to maybe your questions. But who knows, you might be able to get some answers. Okay, moving on to question 12. What resources help a researcher who wishes to check the status of a revenue ruling? So I will tell you, when it comes to online databases like Checkpoint, CCH, Lexis, Westlaw, online databases, you don't need to use an online database for everything. But I will tell you, if you're trying to check the status of a revenue ruling or a case or regulation or whatever to see if it's been superseded or modified or something, online databases are definitely worthwhile to do this. So there's a term, it's kind of a generic term, it's called shepherdizing, and Lexis actually owns the rights to the Shepherd service. There was actually a service that would shepherdize case law, and the idea is that it would state whether a court's decision has been overruled, been upheld by other courts, been cited, distinguished, all different types of things. So shepherdizing is now it's a generic term. There was actually a Shepherd service named after someone named Shepherd that's actually in the Lexis, but you'll have the key site and the all these different measures to check your citations in Checkpoint and Westlaw and CCH that you can check the status of a respective revenue ruling or case. Okay, let's move on to question 13. Of what relevance to the tax practitioner is a revenue procedure? So although revenue procedures may not be useful in arriving at a solution at a technical problem because they're not factual like a rev ruling, such pronouncements are important in that they provide information to the public as to the handling of certain administrative matters. So they're more general. They're more general in nature. They are not factual with respect like a revenue ruling, where the revenue ruling has a set of facts and you can kind of compare and contrast like a case. Now, a lot of revenue procedures, as they state, a rev proc deals with procedural issues, but not all deal with procedural issues. There are also substantive issues. They're just more general application. Now, anytime you have inflation adjustments or a process for filing for a private letter ruling, you're going to find these in revenue procedures that are issued. Okay, let's move on. Question 14. Discuss the difference between a revenue ruling and a revenue procedure. All right, we've already done this, but let me summarize it as succinctly as possible. So revenue ruling is more factual. It's more factual in terms of scenario. And go ahead, just stop the video. Go look at a rev ruling. I pulled one up in my introduction video to this topic, Administrative Tax Authority. It's more factual, like a memo. So again, you can compare and contrast. So it's like a memo with facts, issues. A rev procedure is more general. So it's answering, dealing with more general areas of law, providing specific updates or clarification of a general area of law. It's not going to give you factual situations. They're both issued by the national office, just so you know, and I would say they have the same weight of law. Some people argue revenue rulings might be stronger because, again, you have that factual element. Revenue procedures might be stronger because there's less issued than revenue rulings per the year generally. You can make arguments for both sides. I think it just comes down to what you're trying to do, what you're trying to figure out, whether one is more binding than the other, one's stronger than the other. I would say they're both a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, as I showed in the introduction video. So that's really what they are. Revenue ruling is more factual, like a case, a memo or a case, where you got the facts, conclusion, all that stuff, the opinion. Revenue procedure, though, is more general in application. All right, question 15. Identify 3 types of letter rulings that are of interest to the tax research. Tax researcher, my apologies. Indicate whether each of these rulings is published by the IRS. So there's letter rulings in many forms, and the main ones I would say, picking three, private letter ruling, PLR, I would say that's definitely the most common. Also, determination letters are common as well. So determination letter is the second. And then the third one, I would say, is a TAM, Technical Advice Memorandum. Okay? And we're going to talk about all these later on. But the IRS does not publish any of these rulings in any official collection, but they are available from several commercial sources. So again, the best way to locate these is online databases. You can access some of these on the IRS website as well as through other sites. But again, it's always best to go through an online database because they can make sure that something is, they can give you notes like caution if something has changed. So private letter rulings, determination letter, TAM, they're all dealing with factual situations. Let's go on to question 16. Which IRS office issues private letter rulings? Who may request a private letter ruling? What issues are covered in a private letter ruling? Let's answer the first question. I'm going to do that in black font, and then I'm going to change the color. So which IRS office issues private letter rulings? The national office. So it's issued at the national office in DC. It's not regional. It's not district office. It's at the national office. Okay, let's move on. Who may request a private letter ruling? A private letter ruling can be requested by any taxpayer as long as it's a respective issue. So taxpayers can request a private letter ruling, and early, one of the first revenue procedures, one of the first rev procs each year gives the procedures for how a taxpayer can request a PLR. So pretty much a taxpayer with certain issues, so certain issues have to apply, and it has to be a prospective transaction. So any taxpayer that has certain issues with prospective transaction, you do have to pay a fee. Again, that's all in the Rev Proc. And if you want to stop the video and go take a look at the Rev Proc that deals with that, go pull it up. Go start with Rev Proc, the first one, second one, third one. Eventually, you're going to come up to the procedures for a private letter ruling. What issues are covered in a private letter ruling? There's very, very many issues. It's easier to know what issues are not covered. And again, you can get that in the Rev Proc. So if you look in the Rev Proc, it will tell you what issues you cannot file. For example, there's certain issues with medical expense deduction under Section 213 that you cannot get a private letter ruling on. Okay, question 17. Sometimes a PLR is generalized and included in an official IRS publication. What form does this recast private ruling take? Okay, we talked about this earlier. If you want to stop the video and think about it, I'll give you a second. Did you figure it out? It's going to be a revenue ruling. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of times revenue rulings come from private letter rulings. Not the other way around. Not a lot of times a private letter ruling will turn into a rev ruling. It's more so just that a lot of times a revenue ruling comes from a private letter ruling because it's actually a real fact pattern. A lot of times taxpayers will file that fax with the IRS, and that's how the IRS gets that fact pattern. So the answer is it'd be a revenue ruling, and they have very similar structures. The idea, of course, is that a revenue ruling is much more formal. It's binding. Private letter ruling is not. So similar structure, a private letter ruling and a revenue ruling. Revenue rulings and revenue procs are different, so that means that a private letter ruling would have a different structure from a revenue procedure. All right, let's move on to question 18. What is a determination letter? Which office of the IRS issues determination letters? What kinds of issues are addressed therein? So let's go ahead and start with the first part of the question. What is a determination letter? A determination letter is similar in purpose and nature to a private letter ruling. So it's similar to a private letter ruling. Similar to that. Except that it's issued by a local IRS office. That answers our second question. Which office issues? It's going to be a local, or a district or regional, usually local office, not national office. And then what kinds of issues are addressed? You're going to see that determination letters a lot of times deal with the same issues. They're not like private letter rulings that deal with just a host of issues. There's multiple issues that a determination letter deals with, but I'll just give you some of the main ones. And it's much more limited than a private letter ruling. Talking about 501c status, whether you're a tax exempt organization. Talking about certain retirement plans, whether they qualify for certain tax aspects, retirement plans, things like that. Respective, making sure that you have a covered plan, things like that. Retirement plans, 501c, just very qualified plans out there. If you deal with qualified plans in the tax law, stuff like that. Let's move on to question 19. What is a TAM? Who may request it? What kinds of issues are addressed therein? Does the IRS include TAM in any official publication? So a technical advice memorandum, or a TAM, is issued by the national office. So it is indeed issued by the national office. So again, we're making that distinction. And it's similar to a private letter ruling. So again, a determination letter, a TAM, and a private letter ruling are all similar. The main difference between the three, or among the three, is that a determination letter is issued at the local level and much more limited. Now, TAM is a little different. It's not exactly the same thing. Let me explain. It is similar to a private letter ruling, except a TAM is not requested by a taxpayer. So who may request it? It's actually internally requested by the IRS, by an IRS agent. So an IRS agent, this is for question 19. Let me put a little box there. It's not for question 18. IRS agent actually requests it. So taxpayer requests 17 and 18. So if you're trying to write some notes, taxpayers request 17 and 18, the private letter ruling and the determination letter. IRS agent requests number 19, the TAM. What kinds of issues are addressed therein? This could be pretty much, it's very broad. It's very broad in terms of the issues. So private letter ruling was broad, TAM was broad, determination letter much more narrow. Does the IRS include TAM in any official publication? The technical advice memorandum, it's not included in any official publication, but they are open for public inspection through the Freedom of Information Act, and they're available from commercial sites. So when you're starting to get, again, down in your toolbox to these smaller tools, but again, still very important tools, right? Think of like small wrenches or like an Allen wrench set, right? There's sometimes those tools are very, very crucial in terms of fixing your problem or dealing with your issue. The commercial site, it really has everything, and it helps you out here because it just makes tax research so more efficient and effective. All right, so that's what a TAM is. Let's continue on. Question 20. Discuss the precedential value of private letter rulings, determination letters, and TAMs, the three items we just mentioned. What role do these items play in conducting tax research? All right, so first thing, precedential value. So they are primary authorities, and remember that primary authorities are broken into two types, binding and persuasive if they apply. They are not binding, they are persuasive. So they cannot be relied on by a taxpayer simply. You got to have a code section, a case that's potentially binding, a rev ruling, regulation, something out there that can help, or I'm sorry, that provides the actual rule. But these respective items, private letter rulings, determination letters, and TAMs, they can be used and they should be used in doing effective tax research. What role do they play? I explained this earlier. The higher you go, the binding authorities, many of them like Internal Revenue Code, regulations, etc. Many of these binding authorities, they're much more broad, much broader than your fact pattern or your issue. Now you might find a case or a revenue ruling or even a rev proc that narrows it down. Okay, you've got an answer, but there's going to be times where you are going to find issues and facts where there's no case, or maybe there's elements of cases, and then you get into the weeds and you get down in your toolbox, you get to the private letter ruling, and hey, look, I found something in private letter ruling, because private letter rulings there's just so many of them. The idea is that if you can make an argument with the Internal Revenue Code, a regulation, a case, revenue ruling, rev proc, something that's binding. You can argue and make a good argument that it applies to the taxpayer, and then use one of these other administrative authorities, private letter rulings, determination letters, TAMs, chief counsel, the other ones we're going to talk about later that again are considered primary authority, not secondary authority, but primary authority. Then you can put those all together as a package, and it can help build your case. It can say, look, in this private letter ruling, which is very similar to our facts, the IRS ruled this way. And you can say, okay, there's a pattern. There's multiple private letter rulings and they issued this way. It's very similar to our facts. That coupled with an Internal Revenue Code section, a regulation, a case, if you can't get there with those buying authorities, can really complete the package and really help you out. All right, let's go to question 21. Which IRS documents are open to public inspection under IRC section 6110? Okay, so section 6110 authorizes public inspection under the Freedom of Information Act, and I talked about this on the IRS website. You can find this under the IRS website, of unpublished IRS letter rulings. So unpublished IRS letter rulings, let's put LRs, which include private letter rulings, determination letters, technical advice memorandum, and chief counsel advice. So specifically, private letter rulings, determination letters, technical advice memorandums, and chief counsel advice, or similar to chief counsel advice. Those 4 items are the main documents. So let's go ahead and move on. Question 22. What is the precedential value of an IRS written determination letter under 6110? So again, as I said up here, it's considered a primary authority, and it's persuasive. It cannot be binding. You have to have something else. Now, I want to stress this because remember that primary authorities, this is for the understatement penalty, the substantial understatement penalty. So if your position is supported by one of these items, that's good for the substantial understatement penalty for a reasonable basis. So substantial underpayment penalty for those tax professionals that are looking for, to avoid penalties. Very important, the substantial understatement penalty. And that's how I structure, when I teach tax research as a tax professional, I look to those authorities. And I talked about those different authorities in my introduction to tax research video. Okay, 23, question 23. One of the most important IRS publications is the IRB, the Internal Revenue Bulletin. How often is this document published? Name 6 items that typically are published in the IRB. Okay. So the Internal Revenue Bulletin is published weekly. It's published weekly. So how often is it published? It's published weekly. Name 6 items that are published in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. Well, I'm going to actually give you more than 6. So let me change the font. Let's change it to red. So the first thing that's published, going in our list of items, rev rulings. Also, rev procs. IRS acquiescences and non-acquiescences. So those are going to be AODs. We'll talk about those in a moment. New tax laws. So new tax laws, if there's any new tax law, like a tax bill, new tax laws are in those IRBs. So the discussion of those. Committee reports. So going back to our legislative history, we actually have committee reports in there. So even though this is the IRS and it's administrative, they also communicate these things as well. Procedural rules. Procedural rules. New tax treaties. So new tax treaties. Treasury decisions, so TDs, and other notices. But those are the main ones. Let's put a little line here. Make sure we distinguish from question 24. But those are some of the main things. Those are the big ones. But there's others as well when I say other tax authority, but these are the main ones. All right, let's go ahead and move on to question 24. Distinguish between a citation IRB in it and one with CB. So IRB, we just talked about it. IRB is the Internal Revenue Bulletin. Internal Revenue Bulletin, so just like Internal Revenue Service, IRB is Internal Revenue Bulletin. CB is Cumulative Bulletin. Now, before middle of 2008, the way it worked was IRBs would be issued weekly, and then the Cumulative Bulletin every quarter, every 6 months, would basically, you'd have a Cumulative Bulletin and have all of those IRBs in it as grouped. So more IRBs together. basically republishing the same thing. They basically stopped doing that at 2008-2, that version. So the Cumulative Bulletin ended sometime in 2008. So when you have a revenue ruling or Rev Proc, and we'll talk about citations later because citations are so important, you're going to notice that it's going to reference the IRB. If it's past 2008-2, the version, because that's the last Cumulative Bulletin. So if it's 2009 or later, you can't have a Cumulative Bulletin. So keep that in mind. But if it's pre-2008, you can have Cumulative Bulletin. So keep that in mind as well. And you can have either citation. If it's during 2008, it depends on where it fell in the year. Question 25. In what publication or publications would a tax researcher find the official listing of the IRS acquiescences and non-acquiescences to a tax court decision? So that is going to be found in what's called an AOD, And this is known as an action on decision. They're published in the Internal Revenue Bulletin, as we said. So it's found in the IRB. So found in the IRB, the Internal Revenue Bulletin, you can find it in there, right? We had that right here. We answered that question in question 23. AODs were indeed published in the IRB. The Internal Revenue Bulletin Index lists acquiescences and non-acquiescences alphabetically and in code section order. A citatory also can be used to locate and interpret acquiescences and non-acquiescences, so that's within an online database. So you can find AODs in the IRB, you can find them in commercial databases. There's other ways you can find it as well through the Freedom of Information Act and whatnot on the IRS website. Question 26. Can the IRS change its position on acquiescences or non-acquiescences? So yes, it can change. And I'm going to explain the difference between acquiescence and non-acquiesce. So the IRS can change its position. When we're talking about acquiescences and non-acquiescences, we're talking about the issue of the IRS. The IRS is a national agency. It's a national governmental agency. It's all over the country. Now, there's something called the Golsan Rule in the tax court system. It's one of the tax doctrines, I should say. And I have a video on the top 40 tax doctrines. I talk about the Golsan Rule. So the IRS in tax court, it litigates these cases on behalf of the government. So it's representing the government, the IRS. And they have chief counsel, they have attorneys that go out and they argue these cases all around the country. The idea, remember, is that if you don't know, please watch my video on judicial case law and the relevance in tax law. Very important. The tax court is a national court, so it's all over the U.S. just because it's the federal tax law, but it's a riding court, meaning it rides all around to different cities. So major cities like New York, Chicago, L.A., San Francisco, Miami, they all have tax courts, and there's many more cities. I'm just naming some of the big ones. So it's riding circuit. But the idea is it's national, so it's possible, and there's an issue of precedence where tax court judges, they have to follow each other because it's all the same court. The Golsan Rule says that you actually look at the district. So you focus on what the district above says, because when a taxpayer, if they appeal, or the IRS appeals a decision from the tax court or any court of original jurisdiction, the federal district court or federal court of claims, if they appeal to the circuit, court of appeals level for the U.S. circuit that taxpayer resides in. Now, the Golsan Rule says that you're supposed to look at the circuit. So that means it's theoretically possible for the IRS to have to, or the tax court judge to rule, the same judge. This is really interesting. It's theoretically possible that a judge, and let's say the First Circuit, hears a decision. Here's facts. And it's the exact same facts that the same judge hears, and let's say the Ninth Circuit. And the judge is required under the Golsan Rule to look to the Circuit Court of Appeals how they've ruled. And if they use different tests or they come out differently, then it's possible for that judge in the First Circuit, Ninth Circuit, same judge, same facts, to actually have two different results, two different outcomes. For the taxpayer, against the taxpayer. It's possible to have that. That's how this works. So the idea is when the IRS loses a case, they have to acquiesce or non-acquiesce to that specific case. They don't have to, they usually do, okay? Now, the government doesn't really lose many tax court cases, just so you know. It's not as common. The government almost always wins. There are cases where the government does not win. So acquiesce or not acquiesce, these AODs. AODs are issued when the government loses a decision, and basically the national office for chief counsel says, okay, are we going to acquiesce to this and then hold it to the rest of the country? That's what that means. So we're going to basically give in and give up on our argument. Non-acquiescence says, no, we're going to continue to argue the way that we have in that case, even though we lost. So continue to argue. So give in means that we're just going to follow what that court said in all other circuits. Because remember, First Circuit versus Ninth Circuit, you can have different results. I'm not saying that there are different results. Most tax court issues, looking at the circuits usually ends up being the same, but there are some issues where there's different factors, tests, and whatnot. So that's the idea. If the IRS acquiesces, that means that they are going to follow that in all circuits with respect to how the court ruled. If they non-acquiesce, that means that they're going to not follow it in the other circuits. They're just going to continue arguing it across the board because, again, they're a national. They can't say, oh, we're going to argue with this position here and that position there. No, they can't. So that's why they do this. So that is what acquiescence, non-acquiesce deals with. So the question specifically asks, can the IRS change its position? Yes, it can. The IRS can change its position on these items, acquiesce or non-acquiesce, by withdrawing the original AOD, the original pronouncement. This may occur due to a contrary holding in a subsequent court case or a change in the agency's policy concerning the issue. So perfect example dealt with various issues with same-sex marriage. At one time, that was questioned with respect to whether, if it's in a state, can it be held up for federal law? And then at one point, that the federal government took a different stance on that. Look to the states. So that changed a lot of things. That's an example where the IRS position changed, and acquiesce, non-acquiesce, they changed up on that respective issue. Okay, question 27. Must the IRS acquiesce or non-acquiesce to every issue in a court decision? So again, I mentioned this earlier and I had to change. Remember, I had to say, no, that's actually not right. Sometimes, I put the cart before the horse. My apologies. The answer to this is no, not always. So when the IRS loses an issue or decision in court, the commissioner may. So again, AODs are when the IRS loses, when they lose. And even if the IRS loses, on a court case, it might not. It does not have to. Does not have to issue an AOD. Does not have to issue. But again, if you do have an AOD, that means the IRS did lose. So you can't say that, oh, IRS loses on a tax case, therefore they have to issue an AOD. No. But you can say, oh, IRS issued an AOD, that means that the IRS did lose. That's what I'm trying to say. So the IRS loses, that's what an AOD says, and the national office is stating whether the IRS is going to acquiesce or non-acquiesce to that respective issue, how that holding is. And doesn't mean that in all IRS losses that IRS has to issue an AOD. It's only in limited circumstances. All right, question 28. What is an IRS announcement? When is it used? In your opinion, could a tax practitioner rely on an IRS announcement as authority for a tax return position? So IRS announcements, they concern items of general importance to taxpayers, and they contain guidance involving substantive interpretations of the code or other provisions of the law that usually have short-term application. So if it's something that's needed very quickly and going to be very important because there's a expiring window, that's the idea where an announcement comes out. Because the idea is that if it's more formal process takes time. And if there's something that Congress wants to happen quickly, the IRS is going to do that through an announcement, a notice, something more informal. So formal takes time. And if there's no time, the idea is that's going to be through an announcement or through a notice. Now, can an announcement, is that considered primary authority? Yes, but again, it's persuasive authority. So it's primary, persuasive authority. It's not binding on a taxpayer. Announcements are. What about question 29? What is an IRS notice? When is it used? In your opinion, could a tax practitioner rely on an IRS notice as authority for tax return position? The announcement and notice, in my opinion, same. So it's pretty much the same answers. So IRS notices concern items of general importance to taxpayers that have long-term application. They have long-term application. That's the main difference. So short-term for notice, long-term for short-term for announcement. My apologies. Short-term for announcement, long-term for notice. But again, it's something that we need a quick quick turnaround. That's the difference. So something where it could be around for a while going into the future. Short term could just be, okay, well, Congress wants to do wants the IRS to administer a rebate, and in the next few months. Well, after that rebate has been sent out to the taxpayers through and a lot of times they do that through the IRS to administer it because they have the taxpayers' information, right? The addresses. Well, in the next 3 months after it's issued, it's no longer important. So that's why they do things through an announcement. Longer term is something where the IRS needs to issue quickly, right? Because again, formal, right? Formal takes time, and if they need to issue something quickly because it's becoming such a prevalent issue in the tax system, then the IRS will do that through notice. And a lot of times what they'll actually do is they'll issue a notice first, and then maybe they'll do a regulation and go through the process later on. A regulation later on. That's usually what happens with notices. All right, question 30. Question 30, why should the tax researcher exercise caution in relying on an IRS publication, such as published instructions to a tax form and undertaking a research project? I will tell you just straight out, do not cite IRS publications or instructions. I see this all the time in practice, and my students also when I teach my tax research classes, do not cite IRS publications and instructions. You're saying, well, what does that mean? That means I can't go there and rely on those? No, the courts, and there's a case called Adler, and in my video, my intro video to the administrative tax authorities, I talk about this respective issue. There's a tax notes article, very, very well written tax notes article, covered so many different cases, and the idea is that different taxpayers have tried to argue that, oh, I followed the IRS's publication. I followed the instructions. And then they go to court and the IRS basically says, well, you followed that and yeah, we issued that, but it's not binding. So basically, IRS wants to have their cake and eat it too. They want to provide guidance like they're required to do, right? They're required to administer the tax law, but then they don't want to stand behind it. So that creates a big issue. And courts have said, we're going to hold that in favor of the IRS, that these are not indeed binding, so you cannot rely on them at all. So you don't cite them in tax research. You don't use them in position. You can't rely on them for understated penalties. They're not good. You can't use them. Now, there are some limited circumstances that I think you can use them in research, like if you're asked to how to fill out a respective tax return. I think that's when you can use it. That's the only time I've ever used it, when you're filling out tax returns, because it's the IRS's actual document. I go to the instructions and I cite the instructions for filling out a tax return. But for substantive issues of law, procedural issues of law, no. If it's the IRS tax return, then I would say you can use it there. Okay. And by the way, if you're taking my tax research class, none of my memos deal with filing, that respective tax return. I'm dealing with substantive issues or procedural issues, not filing, okay? Not filing. So you're not going to cite publications or instructions in my class. Now, this actually poses an interesting question. What about FAQs? Because the IRS a lot of times will issue FAQs as an informal process, and there's been some arguments that FAQs should be more similar to IRS publications or instructions. They should be more similar to notices and announcements. I think they're more closer to announcements and IRS notices, but there are times where there could be times in the future that, again, courts might say, well, you can't rely on the FAQs because, again, similar to the instructions or publications, they're just informal, extremely informal. All right, let's go ahead and move on to question 31. Now we're starting to move into the proper citation of different authorities. Very, very important, especially if you're taking my class. And you might ask, why exactly am I a stickler for this? Because when you're citing in your tax research memos, and again, I test I'll test the format, but if you're citing in a tax research memo and you give me a citation and it's in proper order, I've had many students and many professionals I've worked with before, they give the wrong citation, I can't find it. Because again, when you're writing a tax research memo, you need to be clear, you need to show your authorities so that audience can look it up if they say, huh, that's interesting, you found that, let me take a look. Maybe I want to see what exactly, maybe look for more, maybe to see if they agree with how you view that. Maybe you're summarizing it, just to take a look. So question 31, in the citation, Reg 1.212-3, what do the 1, the 212, and the 3 indicate? Okay, so first off, we see that it's a final regulation, and the reason we know is there's no proposed regulation at the front, it's just reg, and there's no T. So there's no T. So this is a final regulation. It's finalized regulation. That's the first thing I want to mention. Okay, what about the 1? We're talking about, it's asking about the 1 here. We're talking about this 1 right here. This 1 denotes it's an income tax regulation. So it's an income tax topic issue. What about the section 212? What about the section 212? So the section 212, which you find here, that is the, oh my apologies, I went a little bit too far. The section 212 you find here, that is the code section of the Internal Revenue Code. So that's IRC section 212. I know I put that in order. My apologies. It's IRC section 212. Finally, the 3. So let's change up the font. Let's do green. The 3, which is right here, that is the 3rd regulation in the 212 regulations. In the section 212 income tax regulations, that's what it's saying. It's saying the 3rd regulation. And that's really the breakdown of that citation. So we have a final regulation dealing with income tax found in section 212, and it's the 3rd of the regulations. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next set of questions. Questions 32 through 36 deal with regulations and the citation to regulations. Let's go ahead with question 32. Answer the following questions about this citation, and we're given the citation here. Reg section 20.2039-1A. What does the 20 stand for? So we're talking about this 20 right here. Talking about that 20. That 20 means it's an estate tax topic. So an estate tax topic. What does the 2039 stand for? So let's change up our color of our font. So the 2039, that is the Internal Revenue Code section number. So that's the Internal Revenue Code section. It deals with section 2039. All right, let's change around our font. Let's go blue. So the blue deals with the number 1. So what does the number 1 deal with? That is the first regulation in the section 2039 area of regulations, estate tax regulations. And then finally, change up our font. Let's do green. So the A, what does the A stand for? The A is a paragraph. So that is paragraph A. We have paragraph A. So let's go ahead, put down paragraph A. And that is answering all of those questions. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. So we're just moving right through these. And number 33. Answer the following questions about this citation. Reg section 1.274-6TA2. Okay, let's go ahead and use the same process. Starting with black, what does the 1 stand for? The 1 deals with income tax as the topic. And later we'll talk about all the different ones. And if you're in my class, the main ones I focus on. So income tax. Okay, let's change our font. Red. What does the 274 stand for? So this 274, that is Internal Revenue Code section 274. What does the 6T stand for? So let's change to blue. So the 6T, that shows 2 things. It's the 6th regulation in the group of regulations for section 274, but it also denotes that it is indeed a temporary regulation. Now, again, you'd have to look at the date that it's effective, and depending on the date, it might only be good for 3 years. Chances are, you probably look at this, and you're going to see that it was probably issued before that specific date I talk about in the intro video, so it's probably still good law. But if it wasn't, if it was past that date, then it'd only be good for 3 years, and it would lapse. Okay, let's continue on. Let's go to green. What is the A? The A deals with the paragraph, so that is paragraph A. And then finally, let's switch to yellow. What is the 2? The 2 is sub-paragraph 2. So that is how you would cite that respective, or that's how you would state that respective citation. Okay, let's move on to question 34. Answer the following questions about this citation. 26 CFR section 1.61-21A3. Okay, so first thing it asks for, we're going in order, going down. What is the 1? So we're talking about this 1 right here. So again, just like question 33, it's income tax. income tax. Let's now switch to red. What does the 26 stand for? So the 26 is the 26 before the Code of Federal Regulations. This is Title 26 of the U.S. Code. So you're wondering, okay, well, doesn't CFR mean the Code of Federal Regulations? Yes. It relates. I should say the Code of Federal Regulations means it relates to Title 26 of the U.S. Code, meaning that it deals with tax. It deals with taxes. As you know, Title 26 of the U.S. Code, we learned this in the legislative authorities, is the Internal Revenue Code. And that's where we find the tax law for U.S. government. Same thing here when you have a 26 before the CFR. All right, so now let's continue on. Let's switch to blue font. And it's asking about the section, about the 61. So that is going to be IRC section 61, which many of us know deals with gross income. Okay? Going to green. So green is 21. So the 21, that means I'm going to write over here, stagger this a little bit. 21 means it's the 21st regulation in that set for section 61 regs. In the section 61 set of regulations. Okay. Yellow. I'm just going to do the yellow for both A and 3. The A, that's going to be paragraph A, and the 3 is going to be subparagraph 3. All right. And we've finished our citations. Very important if you're in my class. Very important in tax research because you need to make sure you understand what that's actually saying. Question 35. Give the number that is associated with each of the following categories of regulation. So first, we've got state tax regulation. So what I'm saying is, look in question 32, 33, 34. See after the section number, we've got 20, 1, 1. What do those mean? So estate tax regulations, if you have a 20 before the dot, so it's everything before the dot. So before the dot. I'm talking about this dot right here. You can see the dot, 1 point, 20 points. So that number before the dot, what does that mean? So estate tax regulations, you'll have a 20 there. Income tax regulations, you're going to have a 1. Gift tax regulations, you're going to have a 25. Procedural regulations, you're going to have a 301. And employment tax regulations, you're going to have 31. And there are other types of regulations. If you look in the Code of Federal Regulations, there's other numbers. But these are the 5 most important, I would say. The 5 most common you're going to see. Definitely need to know these if you're in my class. Okay, 36. So now we're doing it in reverse. Like I could ask in 2 different ways. I could ask you to give me what the number is that corresponds, or I could ask you to give me the respective area. So 31 is the first one. Well, we just saw that. 31 deals with employment tax. So employment tax. 301 deals with procedural regs. So procedure. 25 deals with gift tax. Not gift income tax, but gift tax and the wealth transfer tax. 1 deals with income tax. So if you're dealing with Code Section 102 and income tax considerations of gifts, that would be Section 102. That would be found in the 1.102. Okay? Not 25-.102, just so you know. And then 20 is the estate tax. So gift tax and estate tax are separate from the income tax, just like the employment tax is separate. And then procedural rules just provide procedural elements. We're almost there. This is the end of the question set. So let's go to question 37. Explain each of the elements of this citation. Rev Rule 2013-5, 2013-9, IRB 525. So we want to go through each of these items. So the first thing, Rev Rule means IRS revenue ruling. IRS revenue ruling. All right, revenue ruling. Okay, now I'm going to get out the colors. So this 2013-5, and I'm going to do this by alphabetically. So the 2013 means the year that the revenue ruling was issued. So year issued. The -5 is the 5th ruling in the year. In the year, which would be this year. So it'd be 2013. Let's now go to the next set, and I'm going to do that one in blue. So 2013-9 of IRB. So the 2013-5, it modifies the rev ruling. Now the comma, this part right here is just now the IRB citation. That's how you cite in the IRB. That's what that deals with. So IRB, we know, and I'll do that in black. IRB deals with the Internal Revenue Bulletin. Internal Revenue Bulletin. So again, after that comma, the citation is focusing on Internal Revenue Bulletin. Okay, so let's do that blue, that 2013-9. So 2013-9 is the weekly issue. So 2013-9 equals the weekly issue. Specifically, it's the 9th week of 2013. It's the weekly issue of the Internal Revenue Bulletin. And then what is the, we know what IRB means. What does the 525 mean? The 525 equals the page of the weekly issue where we find this revenue ruling where it starts. Where it starts. Okay, where it starts. All right, let's go to question 38. So question 38 is very similar. It's also a rev ruling. So we know that the rev rule is revenue ruling 96-41, 1996-2, CB8. Okay, so I will tell you that this citation is virtually identical to this one. The main difference is this CB means Cumulative Bulletin. Cumulative Bulletin. Now, a few things to note. We mentioned earlier, and I mentioned in the intro video, the Cumulative Bulletin was not issued. It stopped being issued as of the 2008-2 edition. That's the last issue. So the last issue of the Cumulative Bulletin was 2008-2. And again, the Cumulative Bulletin basically took many internal revenue bulletins during the year, maybe quarterly or semi-annually, and it grouped them all together and it would issue it out. So this Cumulative Bulletin is the Internal Revenue Bulletin, but it's more. It's more issues. It's not just the weekly issue for that week. So we know what the revenue ruling is. Let's also talk about the 96-41. So this translates. The 2013-5 and 96-41, they translate, but you might be wondering, well, why is it 2013? Why isn't it 1996? So this is 1996. This is the 41st rev ruling in the year 1996. So we saw above the 2013-5, that was the 5th ruling in the year 2013. So you might be wondering, why is it 96 and why is this one not 13? So in 1998, as a result of the IRS, the bill that dealt with the IRS reconstruction, the change around the structure, restructured, that bill, that major bill, the revenue rulings and the private letter rulings, many different citations, and I talk about this in the intro video, so make sure you go over it. 98 was the last year we could have 98-. So that was the last year. So if you have a 99, everything after that 1998 citation will be 1999. So it might be revenue ruling. So if it's 1999, you wouldn't have 99. You would have 1999-. So that's the idea, is that 98 was the last year because that bill took effect that year, and that was one of the changes as well. They probably were considering, okay, well, now we're going into a new century, right? We're going in, or even millennium, right? Now we're going from 1990s to 2000s, and you got to remember that the income tax continuously from 1913, so they didn't really have to think about this, right? Because every year was 19, but going into the future, we need the year, right? Because if you start getting into the 2076, it's like, well, is it 1976 or is it 2076? So that's why we have this change. That's why they did that, by the way. They thought about the changes for in the new millennium and in the new century and whatnot. Okay, so again, revenue ruling 96-41 is the 41st revenue ruling in 1996. The 1996-2 and the CB8 are very similar as well. I do want to clarify that. This is the 2nd edition. Sorry, let me change that color. Let me use green. Don't want to confuse you with the stuff above. Let's use green on this one. So this is the, let's move it here over, let's just put right here, line. 2nd edition of the Cumulative Bulletin in 1996. And then finally, page 8, or CB8, that's page 8. That's the same thing. So I'm going to put that one in yellow. It's the same idea. It's where that revenue ruling starts. So that breaks down the revenue rulings for you. All right, let's go on to question 39. What is the correct citation for revenue ruling 2002-55, which is found on page 529 of the second CB volume for 2002? So now we're doing the reverse. I gave you the citation. I wanted you to tell me what it is. Now I'm giving you that answer for question 37, 38 and telling you to construct the revenue ruling for me. So again, the abbreviation for revenue ruling, rev ruling. Okay, we got that. Boom, right? Really getting stuff done, right? Moving on. Okay, rev ruling 2002-55. So that's given to you. That's given. So we have that, and that's the same format. So 2002-55. So rev ruling 2002-55. Now we get into the cumulative bulletin. So again, it makes a difference whether it's the IRB or CB. IRB or CB. Okay, so we have a CB here. So it's found on page 529. So we're going to put the CB here. We know that this 529 comes after the CB. We've got our comma. The last thing is we know it's year 2002. So it's 2002. Or I shouldn't say we know, because sometimes when it says 2002, it actually could be issued in 2001, because remember, the federal government has a weird fiscal year. But you know you're going to have 2002 in the citation. It's going to be in 2002 in the second volume. So it's going to be 2002-2. So just like that, this is the correct answer. You've got rev ruling 2002-55, 2002-2, and then CB. Sorry, it should be CB. You should have dots there. Actually, if you don't have dots, that's fine. I say, what I tell people is either use dots. I guess we should say consistent. We put dots here, or you could just leave out the, let's be official. I know in these above there's no dots, but really there should be dots because they're abbreviations. So CB 529. So those are dots there. Okay, let's go on to question 40. What is the correct citation for revenue procedure 94-36, which is found on page 682 of the first CB volume for 1994? So we're doing the same thing, but now we've got a revenue procedure. So we haven't done a revenue procedure yet. We've been doing with revenue rulings. Well, rev rule, right? Rev dot rule dot, right? Or rev dot rule dot. That's the shorthand for rev ruling. What is it for rev proc? And go ahead and stop if you want, and you can try this. Rev proc, just like that. And it's 94-36, so it's what's given to you there. Now we got our comma, and now we've got cumulative bulletin, so we just follow what we did. We can do the C dot B. We know it's on page 682. Last thing, we use 1994 for the year. We use that for the year, so it's going to be 1994 in that. And then for the volume, we're told it's the first volume. So boom, just like that, right? Once you go through this, it makes it so much easier. It's so much easier. All right, question 41. Create the permanent CB citation for the fifth revenue procedure of 2001. So now, we're getting even more in depth, right? This is crazy, right? We're getting more in depth. But once you go through question 37, 38, right, and you gotta rewind it, you know, I get excited about this stuff because when you first look at this, it looks like a bunch of gibberish, but it actually, if you go through question 37, 38, and once you go through these, you're going to master this easy. So create the permanent CB citation for the fifth revenue procedure of 2001. It was published in the second week of the year. It is published on page 164 of the appropriate volume. All right. So this one is a little bit trickier. It's a little bit trickier, okay? So the first thing is, you might have caught this. You're dealing with a CB, and CBs are volumes, right? Not weeks. I give you the second week of the year in 2001. And as I mentioned earlier, and if you picked up on this, just because it's in 2001, it's the second week of the year, doesn't mean it's automatically going to be in volume 1. Why? Remember, U.S. government has a weird fiscal year. Ends September, right? Ends in September. So it actually could be in the second volume. And you would have to do research on this question. I did it for you. So I researched the second week of the year 2001, calendar year 2001, which volume, it's going to be volume 2. So I'm telling you that. I'm telling you that. If you're, by the way, if you're taking my tax research class, you're taking an exam, I would tell you the volume, but I'm just showing you like how this can get a little tricky at times. So we know it's in volume 2 and it's going to be on page 164. Let's go ahead and construct this. So it's a rev proc, right? It's revenue procedure. So we've got rev proc, okay? It's 2001. So we have to think about our year, right? The 1998 rule. So 1998, you can have 98, 97, 96, all the way back, you know, but then if it's 1999 and later, you got to use that year. So since we're dealing with the year 2001, it's going to be the full year. And it's easy. If it's in the 2000s, it's always the full year, full 2000. It's just 99. It's basically every year in the 2000 and 1999. Include 1999. That's the tricky year. So years in the 2000, you got to do the full thing. So it's 2000. And remember, when it comes to rev procs, we saw this earlier, and rev rulings, the 5th revenue procedure is 2000-5. So it's the 5th. So 2000-5. Sorry, my apologies. 2001. 2001. Caught myself there. So you got to be careful, right? If you were putting in your answer on an exam, as long as you catch yourself, then you're golden. 2001. Right? You probably were yelling at me on the computer. No, it's not 2000, it's 2001. You got me. 2001-5. So that is the first part. That's saying the 5th revenue procedure in 2001. Okay, now we go to the CB. Again, I researched for you and told you that in calendar year 2001, the second week, so we're talking about in January of 2001, we were in the second volume of the Cumulative Bulletin because there was actually, volume 1 actually started in the end of 2000. That's how it worked. And there was a lot of tax law, by the way, in 2000, 2001. Okay, a lot of changes there. So RevProc 2001-5. Now we do our Cumulative Bulletin. We're doing the CB citation. So we put our C.B. We know it's on page 164. That's easy, right? That comes after. And then we have to put the correct volume. It's going to be 2001-2. Boom! Just like that. That is the correct citation. All right, let's finish this off. Finish strong. We got 3 questions left. Question 42. Explain each of the elements of this citation. Letter rule or LTR rule 96-15032. If you want to say 96-15032 or you want to say 96, there's no comma, so you can't say 1,000, right, or million. You can't do that. I would say 96 because remember the year, which I'm going to explain. I would say 96-15032 because that's how we group the. That's how we say it in practice. 96-15032 or 32. 96-1532 because as you're going to learn, that's the breakdown of letter rulings. So explain each of the elements. Okay, let's do our colors again to help you understand. So what does this mean? This refers to a private letter ruling. You got it. A private letter ruling. We talked about that earlier. Let's change to another color. Now we jump into the number. So the first part is going to be the year. It can either be a 7-digit private letter ruling or a 9-digit. And many of the citations do 7 or 9. 7 is going to be 1998 or earlier. Remember our 1998 rule. 9-digit will be 1999 and later. Okay, 1999 or earlier will be 7-digit. So 96, that means it's 1996. So it's a private letter ruling issued in 1996. Let's continue on. So the next part we have in green, that is going to be the 15, and that is the 15th week of the year. So this one, like we had the Cumulative Bulletin, I told you that they issue stuff at the end of last year. This one, revenue or private letter rulings are indeed issued in the year. They are indeed issued in the year, just so you know. They're indeed issued in that year. They can't go, you know, before they're by calendar year for that item. So this is where tax gets really tricky, right? That's why you got me to help you. Finally, we got the 32. So we'll do a yellow for that. So we got the 032. You notice there's 3 digits because there's never been more than 900. I don't even think they've gotten any close to 999. That's the 32nd ruling that week. And that's actually quite a bit of rulings that week. 32nd ruling that 15th week. So again, to summarize, we have a LTR.RUL. Okay. That means private letter ruling. 96 means it's in year 1996. If it was in 99 or later, it'd be 4 digits. It'd be 1999 or 2000, 2001, so far going forward. 15 is the 15th week of 1996. And finally, 032, which is the last part, is a 32nd ruling that week of the 15th week. Boom. 43. Let's move on to question 43. Explain each of the elements of this citation. So we're going back to the citation, and this is important because we didn't really use the IRB, so I definitely want to show this. RevProc 2013-4, 2013-3, IRB 283. Okay, so we know first part easy. RevProc is a revenue procedure. Let's move on. 2013-14 means that it's year 2013. Remember, RevProcs actually could take place in 2012 and be called 2013, but we just say it's 2013 is the year reference. We just call it year reference. Again, IRS is a weird fiscal year. It's the 14th ruling that year. So it's the 14th ruling of year 2013. And then we go to our IRB. Now, we haven't done the IRB yet. Okay, well, I guess actually we did in question 37. My apologies, we did. But we've been doing the CB so much. Let's go back to the IRB. So 2013-3, IRB 283. So the 2013, that is the year. That's the year at issue. And the -3 is the 3rd week. So the 3rd week of 2013. Let's do a green. We know what the IRB is. That's the Internal Revenue Bulletin. The 283 is the page number where found, where this revenue ruling starts. Could be over multiple pages, but it's where found, where it starts. Where it starts, right? We got a lot of stuff going here. Let me put a line. Help you out. It's a page number where it's found. So that's where it starts at, where you can find it. It might go over, it's probably going to go over several pages, but that's where it starts. It starts on that page. Very, very important. Now, one thing I want to say before I conclude, notice that, again, you can't have a cumulative bulletin of 2009 or later. And again, if it's 2008, it depends on when it occurred, because the last edition was the 2nd edition of 2008, the 2nd volume. Okay, we got one more and we are done. Woo! Celebrate. Explain each element of RevProc 2000-41, 2000-2, CB 317. So again, RevProc is Rev procedure. Then we've got in blue, we've got 2000-41. It's going to be year 2000. Again, tax reference year 2000, I should say. And it's the 41st ruling that year. Now we got cumulative bulletin reference, so it's a little bit different than the IRB. So the 2000-2, that is the cumulative bulletin 2nd volume of the 2000 reference year. So 2000 year. And then finally our last part, and then we are done. It starts on page 317. And we are officially done. Excellent. Excellent. I really hope that you found this video helpful. Very, very important. Make sure that you understand citations, because when it comes to these administrative authorities, they're a nightmare. Now, you'll notice I didn't talk about all the different citations, because if you master revenue rulings, RevProcs, regulations, and private letter rulings, you've got almost all of them down. The other ones like TAMs and field service advices, they really follow the same structure as the letter rulings, same idea. You got the 7-digit, 9-digit code. All right, make sure you watch my other videos. I've got plenty more tax research videos for you to help you with any of your tax research needs. Go out there and do that, and I'll be making more videos for you, so make sure you watch them.